Ethan Cole arrived in Maplewood on a gray Monday afternoon with little more than a rented van and the quiet hope that distance might dull the sharp edges of his past. The neighborhood was calm, lined with narrow sidewalks and modest houses that seemed to lean comfortably into one another like old friends. It was exactly the kind of place Ethan believed he needed. After years in the crowded city, where noise and memories followed him everywhere, Maplewood felt almost silent. The house he rented was small but comfortable. A pale blue structure with a narrow porch and a patch of grass that needed attention. Ethan stood in the driveway for a moment, studying it, wondering whether this place might finally feel like a beginning instead of another temporary stop. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Ethan spent the afternoon unpacking slowly, placing his laptop and design equipment on a desk near the window. As a graphic designer working remotely, his job allowed him to disappear into quieter places, and that was exactly what he intended to do, but the illusion of control lasted less than an hour. When Ethan tried to open one of the kitchen cabinets, the door sagged awkwardly in his hand. The hinge gave a tired creak and nearly pulled loose from the frame. "Great," Ethan muttered to himself, crouching down to inspect it. That he searched through the small drawer beneath the sink, hoping to find a screwdriver, but the drawer contained nothing except an old flashlight and a few bent nails. After several minutes of trying to push the hinge back into place with his fingers, he finally sighed and stepped outside. Across the street, a man was working on the front steps of another house. Wooden boards and equipment were scattered neatly around him, suggesting someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The man stood tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn gray shirt with rolled sleeves and jeans marked with faint streaks of paint. He was adjusting a railing when he noticed Ethan watching from across the road. "Something wrong?" the man called out, his voice casual but friendly. Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "Kitchen cabinet gave up on me." The man wiped his hands on a cloth and walked over with an easy confidence. "I'm Marcus," he said, offering a quick handshake. Ethan. Marcus nodded toward the house. "New here? Just moved in today." Marcus glanced at the front door and smiled slightly. "That explains the look." "The look?" "I'm already regretting this decision look," Marcus said with a quiet laugh. Ethan found himself smiling despite the long day. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who's fixed half the houses on this street." Inside the kitchen, Marcus crouched beside the cabinet and examined the hinge. Ethan stood nearby, feeling strangely aware of the quiet concentration Marcus carried with him. He moved with practiced ease, pulling a screwdriver from the pouch at his side. "Mind handing me that drill?" Marcus asked, nodding toward a small toolbox he had brought in. Ethan picked it up and passed it over. Their hands brushed briefly during the exchange, and the contact was so small it barely deserved notice, yet Ethan felt the moment linger longer than expected. Marcus tightened the hinge carefully, testing the cabinet door with a firm push. "There," Marcus said. "Should hold now." Ethan opened the door cautiously. "It stayed in place, thank you," Ethan said. "I was already imagining the entire kitchen collapsing." Marcus leaned back against the counter, studying the room. "Old houses do that sometimes. They just need someone to pay attention to them." The comment sounded simple, but Ethan couldn't help noticing the way Marcus said it, as though he understood something about things slowly falling apart. They talked for a few minutes longer, mostly about the neighborhood. Marcus explained that he ran a small renovation business and spent most of his days working on houses nearby. "It keeps me busy," Marcus said. "Busy is good," Ethan replied. Marcus nodded, though something in his expression suggested the word meant different things to him. Before leaving, Marcus glanced around the kitchen once more. "If anything else breaks," he said, "you know where to find me." Over the next few days, Ethan settled into a quiet routine. Mornings were spent working on design projects, afternoons walking through Maplewood's calm streets. Yet he noticed Marcus frequently, sometimes repairing a porch down the road, other times loading tools into the back of his truck. One evening, Marcus stopped by unexpectedly. "Thought I'd check if that cabinet survived," Marcus said. Ethan stepped aside to let him in. "So far, no disasters." Marcus laughed softly and leaned against the counter again, as if the kitchen had already become familiar territory. Their conversation stretched longer than either expected. They talked about work, about the strange adjustment of living somewhere new, about how small towns had a way of slowing everything down. Eventually Marcus mentioned his husband, Daniel. He's a lawyer, Marcus explained casually. Works in the city. The word husband landed in Ethan's mind with a quiet weight. He nodded politely, careful not to let his reaction show. That must keep him busy, Ethan said. Yeah, Marcus replied after a brief pause. Very busy. Something in the way Marcus said it felt unfinished, as though the sentence carried more meaning than the words themselves. Over the following weeks, Marcus stopped by occasionally under small excuses. A loose porch board. A faulty light switch. Minor problems that Marcus seemed happy to solve. Each visit stretched a little longer than the last. They began sharing coffee in the evenings, talking about everything from old movies to the strange unpredictability of life. Marcus was easy to talk to, the kind of person who listened carefully instead of waiting for his turn to speak. Ethan found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. One evening as they sat on the back steps, the sky fading into deep blue, Marcus spoke more quietly than usual. Daniel's been working late again, he said. Ethan glanced toward him but didn't interrupt. Marcus rested his elbows on his knees. Sometimes it feels like we live completely different lives, he continued. Ethan understood the feeling more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years in a relationship that slowly turned into something distant and quiet. People drift, Ethan said carefully. Marcus looked over at him, studying his expression. Yeah, Marcus replied. They do. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Marcus eventually stood, brushing dust from his jeans. I should get going, he said. Ethan nodded, though part of him felt reluctant to end the conversation. At the door, Marcus hesitated briefly. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Marcus. Ethan watched through the window as Marcus walked down the path and disappeared into the dim streetlight. Only then did Ethan realize something unsettling. Marcus's visits were no longer just friendly check-ins, and whatever was quietly growing between them felt far more complicated than either of them had planned. In the weeks that followed, Marcus Hale became a quiet but constant presence in Ethan Cole's life. What began as small repairs gradually turned into longer conversations, and those conversations began to feel less accidental with each passing day. Marcus never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes he carried tools, sometimes coffee, and occasionally nothing at all except an easy smile and the relaxed confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Ethan tried not to question the pattern forming between them, but it was impossible not to notice how naturally Marcus fit into the quiet rhythm of the house. One afternoon Marcus stood on a ladder outside Ethan's back porch, tightening a loose beam that had begun to creak whenever the wind picked up. Ethan leaned against the railing, holding a box of screws while Marcus worked above him. You know, Marcus said, adjusting the drill in his hand, most people would just ignore something like this until it breaks. Ethan shrugged. I guess I prefer fixing things early. Marcus glanced down at him with a thoughtful look. That's rare. Is it? Marcus returned his attention to the beam. Most people wait until it's too late. Ethan wondered if Marcus was talking about more than wood and screws. When Marcus climbed down from the ladder, their shoulders brushed briefly as he stepped past. The contact was casual, but Ethan noticed how Marcus paused for half a second longer than necessary. Neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Marcus wiped his hands on a cloth and sat on the porch step beside Ethan. The late afternoon sun stretched across the yard, casting long shadows through the quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of calm moment Ethan had hoped to find when he moved to Maplewood. Daniel's traveling again, Marcus said suddenly. Ethan turned slightly. Work trip? Marcus nodded. Chicago this time. There was no bitterness in his voice, but there was something heavier than simple explanation. Does he travel a lot? Ethan asked. More than he used to. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When we first moved here, Marcus continued, we talked about fixing up houses together, maybe even flipping them as a side business. Ethan listened carefully. But then his career took off, Marcus said. And suddenly there was always another case, another meeting, another city. He gave a small, almost apologetic laugh. I guess life doesn't follow the plans we make at 25. Ethan understood the feeling all too well. His own past relationship had unraveled slowly, not through anger or betrayal, but through a quiet drifting apart that neither person seemed able to stop. sometimes people just grow in different directions, Ethan said. Marcus looked at him again, this time with an expression that felt more personal. Yeah, Marcus replied. Sometimes they do. The conversation faded into silence, but it was not an empty silence. Instead, it carried a subtle tension that both men seemed aware of yet unwilling to confront directly. Over the next few days Marcus continued stopping by. Sometimes he worked on minor repairs around the house, but often the work felt secondary to the conversation itself. They talked about childhood memories, difficult decisions, and the strange unpredictability of adulthood. Ethan found himself revealing more about his life than he normally would with someone he had known only a few weeks. Marcus had a way of listening that made honesty feel safe. One evening Marcus arrived later than usual. The sky had already darkened, and the porch light cast a soft circle across the steps when Ethan opened the door. Everything okay? Ethan asked. Marcus stepped inside slowly, carrying a small toolbox. Your back gate looked loose, he said. Figured I'd fix it before it becomes a problem. Ethan suspected the gate was not the real reason Marcus had come, but he didn't challenge the explanation. They worked quietly in the backyard for a while. The night air was cool, and the neighborhood had settled into a comfortable stillness. When the gate was finally secured, Marcus remained leaning against the wooden fence instead of leaving. You ever notice, Marcus said thoughtfully, how quiet this place gets at night? Ethan nodded. That's why I moved here, he said. I needed the quiet. Marcus studied him for a moment. And did you find it? Ethan considered the question carefully. At first, he answered. Marcus smiled slightly. And now? Ethan met his eyes. Now it's a little more complicated. For a moment the distance between them seemed smaller than it should have been. Marcus looked away first, running a hand through his hair as though trying to organize his thoughts. Daniel called earlier, he said. Ethan waited. He's coming home tomorrow, Marcus added. The words were simple, yet they shifted the atmosphere immediately. Ethan nodded slowly. That's good, right? Marcus hesitated. Yeah, he said. Of course. But the answer lacked conviction. They walked back toward the porch together, neither speaking for several seconds. Before leaving, Marcus paused at the doorway. You know, he said quietly, I didn't expect to make a friend here. Ethan smiled faintly. Neither did I. Marcus studied him for another moment, as though debating whether to say something else, but instead he stepped outside and headed toward the street. The next evening passed quietly. Ethan focused on work, trying not to think about Marcus or the strange uncertainty that had begun to surround their friendship. Around 10 o'clock, a sudden knock broke the silence. Ethan opened the door to find Marcus standing on the porch. His usual calm confidence had been replaced by visible tension. Marcus. Ethan said. What's wrong? Marcus stepped inside quickly and closed the door behind him. Daniel's been asking questions, Marcus said. Ethan felt a chill of unease. Questions about what? Marcus exhaled slowly. About where I've been spending my evenings. The room fell silent. Ethan realized that the quiet connection they had been carefully avoiding had finally begun to attract attention. Marcus looked at him with an expression that mixed concern and uncertainty. I didn't think he'd notice, Marcus admitted. Ethan understood the implication immediately. Their friendship, whatever it had quietly become, was no longer invisible. And as Marcus stood there in the dim light of the living room, Ethan felt the first real sense that something far more complicated was beginning to unfold.